and welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. This is the fourth is this too loud? It's okay? This is the fourth in a series of 4 workshops about evidence-based teaching. And what I'm going to try to do today is really 2 things. One is to bring together what we've talked about in our first 3 workshops to really get to this question of how to design a class. And second is to give you a chance to think about your class, either the real class that you are or could be teaching, or something that you expect to teach in the future. Most of the time, we don't think about how to design a class because we have felt that what happens in a class is intuitive, right? And we talked about this some in the very first workshop. Those of you who either were here or watched the video may remember that I told you about this story where the tadpole Poulet grows up and becomes a frog and then comes back and tells his friend the fish about what cows are like, and the fish's picture of a cow is inaccurate. The fish has a poor understanding of cows. And the key point here is that the frog is essentially doing everything right. Yeah, this seems too echoey to me. I'm just going to move it down. The frog is an expert. The frog is clearly explaining things. The frog is well motivated and well prepared. But it simply doesn't work to take knowledge out of our heads and put it into other heads. The fish, having no experience of cows, makes it almost impossible for the fish to have a true understanding of what cows are like. And again, as I mentioned in the first workshop, we often don't even determine that we've made a mistake because the exam or other assessment questions that we give our students can be answered even without true understanding. So the fish could answer these questions without true understanding of cows. So we have these 2 problems, right? The problem of transfer of knowledge and the problem of knowing correctly whether we have transferred knowledge. So how can we think about these when we're designing a class? I think the key is to flip how we think about what happens in class. So last time, I showed you this quote and said we need to think about it from the outcome. Sometimes for design, even though it's not really backward because you should think of your goal when you're planning something, but if you think first of the outcomes you're going for, then what you're doing is you're thinking of what the student is doing. And I think that's the key when you design a class. What do you think? I'm going to say this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to show them this. I, right? And what you want to think is, what are the students doing? What are they doing before class? What are they doing in class? What's happening in their brains in class? And what are they going to do after class based on what we did in class? So once you think about it from the student's perspective, it's easier to figure out how to change that brain, how to change the brain of the student. So what we're going to do today is this idea of outcomes-based design or backward design, which basically has 3 parts, all right? And the first part, and we've talked about this before some, is to figure out exactly what it is that your goals are. And again, this has to be from the perspective of the student, as we'll talk about more in a minute. And then we'll go through the rest of this process as we go through this hour today. What would be evidence that the students had achieved that goal? And what should you do in class to promote these different goals that we have for our students? So let's start with the first step, all right? If we want to find out what is it that we are hoping that students can do at the end of our class. So don't think my goal for this class is that I teach them about medieval philosophy. But my goal for this class is that students can, and now you don't want to say that students understand medieval philosophy, because what does it mean? What could they do if they understood medieval philosophy, right? So it's not it's in their head, but what can they show you? What can they do? Because that's the only thing we can find out. What are they able to do? So as we've talked about some before, you really, when you plan your goals for your students, you should always be thinking of what they can do. And I'll give you an example of an error that I made with regard to this. When I started to write goals, I used the word understand a lot, because that's how I thought of it. I want you to understand the kidney. And so I would write things like, I want you to understand the function of the cranial nerves, these nerves that go into and out of our brain. So I use this word, understand. And I've told you previously that there are these great verbs that are much better than the word understand that we can use, but initially I didn't know that. And so I would make a question like this for my students. This cranial nerve that has this function, which one is it? And the students could answer this quite easily. It was no problem for them. And I would ask them then a question that, from my perspective, is basically the same question, right? I'd say, okay, you're gonna have a root canal. Which cranial nerve needs to be anesthetized, right? Well, from my perspective, as someone who understands cranial nerves, this is the same question. It should be easy. But there are many students who can answer this question, and they can't answer this question. In fact, they don't even know how to go about answering this question. And we might respond and say, "Ah, stupid students," right? But in fact, the students didn't know that I wanted them to be able to answer a question like this. Fundamentally, I didn't tell them that they had to be able to answer a question like this, and that really I don't care if they can answer this question if they can't answer this question. So if we go back to the verbs here, and those of you who are here when we were talking about this know that these also exist in Czech, so you don't need to reinvent them if you're using them in Czech language. But if I had said, predict which cranial nerve is involved given a real life situation, then they would have been much more prepared to answer the question that I really wanted them to be able to do. So this word understand, apply, analyze, these things all mean different things to us and our students. They're not something the student does. Understanding isn't something that you do. Okay, so now I'm going to give you an example from one of the faculty members I've been working with at Lékařská fakulta Pilsen, and it's a professor of histology and embryology named Zbigněk Tonar, and he has written his goals for this particular topic. He's written them for all the topics, and he's written them in Czech and in English, but I'm going to use the English versions today. And this one happens to be about development of the heart, and it's sort of the example goal sheet we'll be using today. And you can see that his goals, he's very well trained, are written using verbs that are telling the student, and of course he gives these to his students, what they need to be able to do. So that's something that I want you guys to get practice with today, and I'm going to pass out some worksheets to that with that goal in mind. But if you haven't gotten your worksheet yet, the first one is to first think about a topic, all right? So think about some topic. So for Zbigněk, it was development of the heart. Something that you teach about, or if you train people, if you train business leaders or faculty members or something like that, then you could think about that topic. And then think about something, some goal that you have for your students that relates to that topic. So some specific goal. And first work on this on your own, and then you can, I've got more up front, one moment, here's some for you guys. And first the topic and then the goal. Work on it on your own, and then you can discuss it with those who are sitting around you. If you do have a goal or two written down for number 2, and if you don't yet, that's fine, just keep thinking about it. But if you do, share it with your neighbors, and I encourage you to be supportive but critical of your neighbor's goal. In other words, try to push them to shape it into something that's really an action goal, something the students are able to do. Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt your conversations, and you will have more time to discuss this during today's session. Is anyone willing to just volunteer? And if you wrote it in Czech, you can say it in Czech. The purpose isn't to train me anyway, I hope. Anyone willing over here to volunteer a goal they came up with? Because people can really learn from each other's goals if we do a little. No? Huh? Czech or English? Or German, I guess. I mean, I don't know how many, a diminishing number of people that can understand this. Spanish, Esperanto. Here's some volunteers I can see over here. How about one of yours? Thank you. You can just yell. I don't have my mic, the travel.
So, one of the most important concepts, non-adherence to treatment is a result of lack of insight into illness.
Non-adherence to treatment is due to lack of insight into illness, okay.
And so what students I want them to be able to do with this knowledge is I want them to be able to interview the patient in order to identify lack of insight.
Okay, so be able to identify lack of insight from an interview maybe would be the absolute clearest way to put that. Thank you very much, that's a good example. Can we have another example? Thank you.
I could have one. So the concept I would like to get from the students is that the environment of the atom in some material influences some hyperfine structure in the spectrum. Mm-hmm. So, and what I would like them to do with this knowledge is when I give them some information about the material, I would like them to give me or to predict the shape of the spectra.
Perfect. So it really, I think it really gets to the real skill and not talking about it. That predict verb is very useful, I think, there. Anyone back there want to share a goal? Or anyone else? One more? Thank you.
I teach about volunteering, the management of volunteering, and so there are two types of the management of volunteering. One is homegrown, the second one is workplace, more modern. And I would like them to be able to assess which model of volunteering is suitable for non-profit, depending on its size and its type, like whether it's a membership association or an agency, and its sphere of activity, and explain why.
Yeah, so they have to take into the context, make the decision, and explain the decision. Yeah, well said. Anyone else want to share their goal? One of their goals? So far, these are excellent examples of action-based goals. If you heard those and you thought, oh, mine isn't really action-based, you'll have a chance to think about it again as we go through. So if we think about Zbigniew's goals, then we can think about how, just as examples, how he could take the next step. So our next step is, how do you know? So you named some great goals, right? But how do you know whether your students can actually do those goals? And one way to think about this is if your dean or another administrative authority came to you or to your department and said, prove that your students are achieving the goals. And this, if it hasn't happened to you yet, it's coming. Maybe slowly across the Atlantic, but It's going to happen. Now, hopefully you care for yourself and not just because some dean might care later. But how could you prove to just a critical person, whether it's you as the critical person or an accreditor, that the students really are able to achieve that, right? What evidence could you provide that they wouldn't just say, yeah, but do they really understand? So if you think back to the cranial nerve question, if my students could pick out the right cranial nerve from that boring list, did that show that they really understood it, or just that they kind of know the words of the definition, right? So that's the goal here, is to think about some assessment, whether it's an exam question or an action that students are actually taking, an essay that they're writing, something they're constructing, anything, that's some kind of assessment that truly distinguishes those who understand and those who don't. I'm going to give you a very simple example. Some of your goals will be more complex than this. But to take a very simple example of Spinjak's, he wants them to basically understand, but he's used the word compare to be more precise, how blood circulation differs in fetuses and in babies. So before and after birth, because there's a bunch of things that change, mostly based on the fact that fetuses don't breathe. So things change. And he wants to see if they really can tell the difference. And one way to see if they can really tell the difference is to simply refer to some specific person. Now, this is just a person he made up for the test. So it's not like this is a patient the students know, but he's just saying, okay, now, but in this particular situation, what will change before and after birth? Sometimes we don't want to ask our students a multiple choice question. We want to have them write out the answer. So he might ask this written question, or short answer question, as we say in my country, list 3 differences, in this case, between the pattern of prenatal, so before birth and after birth blood circulation. Or he could ask the question on an oral exam, in which case, really, you just have to read the goal to the student. Hey, student, compare the circulation in before and after birth. So if your goal is very straightforward, then essentially all you're asking students to do is perform the goal. So your task now, and if you turn over your sheet, you'll see question number 3. Don't do number 4 yet. Your task now is to think of something that the students could realistically do in one of your standard assessments, or maybe you can make up a new assessment, but it has to be realistic. So for your real class, you can't ask students to build a bridge, or whatever, but, or to do the open heart surgery, but you can ask them to answer a particular question, perhaps of one of these types, or perhaps it's a longer written or oral answer. So think about that first on your own, and then you can discuss it with each other. Once again, I'm sorry to interrupt your what sound like fruitful conversations. You will have one more chance to discuss things with each other, and I hope many more chances to discuss this sort of thing with your colleagues in the future. So here comes a point that I think is the hardest point, because honestly, sometimes we already come up with really good exam questions, do we not? Sometimes you're like even sitting in the pub and you're like, man, did I write a good exam question? This one's really gonna separate the sheep from the goats or the wheat from the chaff. I don't know what you say in Czech. What do you separate in Czech? What do you separate? The grain from the part of the grain you eat from the part of the grain you don't eat, yeah. Wheat from chaff, we would say, yeah. Yeah, so, you know, and that's good. You actually do want to separate the wheat from the chaff, so that's okay. But then what happens, right? You have this awesome exam question that's actually really hard, and the students do awful, right? Most of the time. And then even then, sometimes we're proud. We say, oh, my class is very rigorous. I'm very tough. And maybe you are, and again, that's not necessarily bad either. But usually, if we write an exam question that's really separating the wheat from the chaff, the grain that you eat from the grain you don't eat, or the sheep from the goats, If the students do badly, it's not because only a few students are capable of answering that question, but usually it's because we gave the students no practice with a question that was that difficult during the class. We gave them no opportunity to develop the skills to be able to answer that question. If your exam questions are harder than anything you ask students to do before the exam, you need to rethink what's happening in class. And so that's what we're going to talk about now, is what happens in class. So you know what you want your students to be able to do. You know how to tell whether they can do it. Now, how are we going to help them learn how to do it, right? So what are you actually going to do in class? What can we do that can help students perform, do whatever it is that you wanted them to do in those exam questions that you just wrote? And here I have what I think is a really good piece of news. I hope it feels like good news to you. It always does to me. So if you look at this whole thing, and again, this is just Zbigniew's for this one topic, development of the heart. And if you look at this, it's kind of overwhelming. You think, wow, this is a lot. I have to do all this stuff with my students and teach them how to do all of these things. This is going to take a long time. I don't have that much time. But actually, if you look at this, there's a lot of stuff on here that you don't really need to discuss with your students at all. So what I told Zbigniew when I saw this is, well, look at all this stuff. All these things that you want them to define and use, they ought to be able to find that from the text. He has a very good text that he gives them, or handouts that you give them, or the internet in certain places. Name the 3 layers of the heart tube. There's no reason to waste class time telling them how to do that. They can look that up. Things like this, which veins carry blood where? Well-known basic information accessible to anyone, anytime, on a small device available in their pockets. So we don't need to talk about any of this stuff. And I told him, just don't talk about that at all. Give them this sheet and just skip it. And he was like, no way, right? Because how are they going to learn it if I don't tell them? But the first time I did this, it was amazing. The students actually did. Well, I would say the second time, because the first time, they don't believe you. But the second time, they'll go and learn all this stuff, and you can tell them, hey, if you have questions about this, here I am. Like, bring them to class or my office hours or whatever. I'm available to help you with these. But I think that you could basically get this information on your own. And so what does that mean is now you have all of this class time when you're not listing veins on the board, because that doesn't need to be done in class. That's something you could do outside of class, reading, video, whatever. So now, what about this predict goal that he's got? Predict the consequences of atrial septal defects upon blood circulation after birth. This is hard. First, students have to know what the atrium is. They have to know what an atrial septal defect is. And they have to understand how blood circulation changes after birth. We talked about that one earlier. And sort of why. You have to understand blood flow and blood pressure and things like this to answer this question. So this is quite hard. So what can he do, right, to help them learn how to do this? Here's how I think of it. All right? So this is from a couple months ago. We visited some friends in Switzerland. We live in a flat, hot place. So we don't ski. My family, we do not ski. All right? But, you know, my son Ben was like, okay, I'm going to learn to ski. So my Swiss friend taught Ben how to ski. And so what happened, right? She didn't tell him how to ski and then ask him on a test. She didn't either tell him how to ski and then have him ski, right? She was there. So what's happening? He's practicing, and he's getting instant feedback from an expert, a Swiss person, right? And he's getting feedback himself, right, as he skis, and she's saying, don't point your toes out. And he's seeing what happens if he points his toes out. And she's telling him what to do, don't look down, look up, and all these other things. So this is how you want to think about what's happening with your students. That you want to give them something hard to do, that you want to build it up, right? Here they are in the States, we call these bunny slopes, the things that are almost flat, right? They just go down slowly, the beginner's slopes. So you scaffold it, you do it gradually. You give them something hard to do, gradually increase the difficulty, and you're constantly saying, yep, that part's right, that part's not right, this is good, that's not good, as you go. In other words, your presence as the expert is critical. So I'll just give you a couple examples from Zbigniew's goals, and then you can do yours. So if we stick with this atrial septal defects thing, what if he just stopped during class? So maybe he wants to explain briefly what this is in class, spent a little 5-minute mini lecture, something like that. And then he says, okay, here's your a newborn who's born with an atrial septal defect. And specifically, this is what's happening. So he's even helping a little by sort of explaining in this question what defect is present. Which of these are going to happen? And in fact, more than one of them happens, but not all of them. So the students have to think about specifically what could happen and why, and how these could be related to each other, giving them choices. So you see, he doesn't just say what would happen. And you can see this, and you can try it both ways in your classes, but if you give people choices like this, you get much better conversation and movement in their logical thinking than if they're just given what do you think will happen? But if you say, which of these things will happen, that really motivates the conversation and decision making, and I didn't do that. Definitely. Well, anyway, it's time for you. During this, while you're working on this, we'll see if we can make the slides work again. So if you look at the last one that you have to do, you want to think about what can I have students do that gives them practice? And just to give you an example from one that's already come up, well, you were talking about having your students be able to get the information from an interview, right? Well, they should be either at the very least watching interviews, right? And hopefully participating in mock interviews in class to practice that skill. So work on that, and we'll work on making the screen work. Brilliant. Sorry to interrupt you, but I think it might be useful with one more example. If he is looking for this, for them to understand this complex thing called transposition of the great arteries, which means that basically just that for the two big arteries that leave the heart, one of which goes to the lungs and the other to the rest of the body, that's it. They're swapped. This is bad, okay? But it's hard for students to understand why it's bad. And so I think this just illustrates the principle I was just telling you, that if you just say, why does this need to be corrected? The students will just sit there. They don't know how to begin thinking about this. But if you give them these options, it's a good way to help them start thinking about this sort of problem. You don't always need to do that, but giving them something concrete to hang on to can be useful. Okay, that's the end of my interruption. You can return to thinking about your own goals. One more time, I'm sorry to interrupt your conversations, and I hope that you get a chance to continue those conversations with your colleagues, either the ones that you've been talking to today and or other colleagues that you have at your, in your home department. So hopefully you're thinking along the lines of students practicing the skill, right? Again, always go back to the skiing in your head. Is the student practicing the thing that you want them to be able to do? So often for these medical things, what I'm thinking of is students learning to solve problems, because essentially as we train physicians, we're training them to solve problems. But you may be training your students to make arguments or evaluate arguments or do many different things. So what you ask your students to do in class is different. There's no one right way to give your students experience with the skills you want them to train in. It depends on you, on your students, and especially on your discipline. A few things we know, though, are broadly true. One is giving students a decision to make rather than an open-ended question produces better thinking and discussion among students. Secondly, students will probably learn more if at some point you let them talk with other people about their answer to this question. A very common way to do this is what's called the think, pair, share, where first you give a question like this and students think about it on their own for maybe 30 seconds or 1 minute, depending on how complex the question is. Maybe they somehow vote or write down their answer at that point, maybe not. And then, after they've thought about it themselves, they talk about it with each other, and then again discuss or vote, or somehow you gather feedback about what they're thinking. If you just ask them immediately to talk to each other, sometimes you get a dominance of the discussion by relatively extroverted students. And so the think, pair, share tends to level the playing field and get more voices into the discussion. There are other ways to ask students things that aren't interrupting whatever else you're doing in class. So for example, many times I'll do something that I call the ticket out of class, which I totally didn't invent, which is a similar type of question that we've just asked students, but now we're asking them to do it in the last 1 to 2 minutes of class. They hand you a piece of paper as they walk out of the room, and then after class, you look through these. You don't need to grade them or mark them. You just look through them and say, okay, they understand this, but they don't really get this part, or this is the part that's confusing them, or they completely understand this, and they're ready to move on to the next level. So when I ask my students to, because it so happens that this particular goal, the transposition of great arteries, is one that I share with Zbigniew. I ask my students to do this. And I find that the problem is that the students can't picture in their head what's happening. They don't have any three-dimensional picture of what's happening. And so if we can get over that step, we can get them conceptually to the idea where they can understand this pathology. So this is what I ask them to do. And really the main effect of it is the students see themselves that they don't know. It just gives them feedback. Oh, I don't really understand how this is physically manifesting in the body. Okay, so in general, when you're thinking about this last step, designing course activities, picture the skiing. Remember that the students can only learn things by doing something with their own brain and or body if they're skiing. It can't be just something from your own brain. If the main brain that's working in class is yours, you need to think again about what's happening. I think also sometimes we see our students, we give our students hard things to do and they struggle. And we think, oh, I need to make this easier. And maybe you need to start with something easier, it depends, but if there's no struggle, there's no learning. If they got it right away, then they didn't really need you to give them that problem, right? They already could have figured it out. So if you see them struggling, remind them. I think students think, oh, learning should be easy. And if it's not easy, it means I'm not good at that thing. So remind them that learning, you struggled to learn this thing. Maybe you don't even remember, or maybe you didn't struggle, but many people struggle to learn these difficult things we teach our students, and they do that. Last thing always, when you give your students a question, drawing, whatever it is that you're asking them to do, make sure they find out. In what way was I successful with this, and in what way was I incorrect, or need to think more about context, or whatever the situation is, because just with skiing, again, you can only improve as you find out, oh, that didn't work, but this works, and moving forward. Often we ask students to do things and then they don't ever find out until it's too late, essentially, how to fix it. The very last step that you want to think about for your class is, of these three things that we talked about, are they actually aligned? That is, do they actually match? So when you look at your exam, does it only pick out your favorite learning goals, or does it pretty much cover them all fairly evenly? Because if it doesn't, students are going to start to learn that and not going to bother learning the goals that are never on the tests. And that's bad because we want them to learn all the things. So make sure these two are matched, and that's why I put that arrow in red. Make sure those are matched. But then also make sure that your learning activities are supporting everything. So I told you that I don't do, learning goals in class if I think that they're some things students can learn on their own, but I make sure that students have a good source of information for learning that on their own. In other words, I tell them, you should find this in the text, or here's a video link about this, or whatever. So make sure you're supporting all your learning goals in one way or the other, and that the students know what they are. The last mistake I think that's pretty common is that sometimes we do things in class, and sometimes this is criticized as like active learning for active learning's sake, where the students are doing something fun, they're playing a game in class, but it doesn't really support anything that we're trying to do. We're just trying to be exciting, active learning teachers. So don't active learn for active learning's sake. Do it because you're giving students practice towards some particular goal. It's just like technology. Technology can be a great tool for teaching, but by itself, it doesn't magically improve your teaching, right? In fact, it sometimes may take away from it if there's other things that you could be doing that are more effective. All right, so then if you look at your class, right, so you design a class and you look at it, and you say, okay, I've got my specific learning goals, the assessments are based on those goals, and I give students practice in achieving them, and all these things lined up with each other, so we have that alignment, you have a good class. In other words, this is a basic way in which you can say, am I a good teacher? Is this class good? And if the only way you're finding out is by asking students, in the student evaluation form, it can be useful in some ways, but as we all know, it's a limited way to get information on how effective your teaching is. And this is a more robust way, and it should be, and it's becoming in some places, something that you can take to your dean and your department chair and say, this is what I'm doing, this is why it's effective, here are ways in which it's not effective and that I'm improving it. But a good way to think about your classes. This particular type of thinking, of course, was not remotely invented by me, and it's been promulgated for a long time. This is, I think, a helpful quote about this. So we want to think of students uncovering. We always think like, I'm going to cover all the content. I'm going to talk about everything. But if we think of students uncovering it themselves, that's the situation. It doesn't seem efficient, but that's the situation in which they're going to learn. These are my students drawing neurons. They're drawing all the parts of a neuron and putting it all together and making lots of horrible mistakes. There were like 5 mistakes in that picture. But that's good because they're struggling in improving their ability to do that. If you want more information about this, these are 2 books that are really outstanding that sort of take you through this process. And this author, Dee Fink, also has a free workbook online. And if that's too long to sort of copy down, first of all, this video will be posted shortly. And also, you can just email me and ask for the link, and I'm happy to send that to you. And some of what you went through today is basically the same thing that Dee Fink takes you through in his online workbook. Okay, the last thing I want to say is this is the last workshop that's scheduled in this series, but I'm in the Czech Republic until June 23rd. So if there's anything that I can do for you, for your department, for your colleagues, for your students between now and then, please don't hesitate to ask after the lecture, or again by email, or call me, or whatever you like. So that's why I'm here, is to help people improve teaching and learn about teaching myself. So I'd be happy to do anything I can with your colleagues and department. Thanks a lot for this opportunity and for all your participation. You guys have been a fantastic group to work with, and it's been a real pleasure to be here. Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions if you have time. Criticisms, shout outs, whatever you like. Anyone? Yep.
Hi, it's a very easy question. Are you planning to come back to Czech Republic soon?
I would love to come back. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we would actually love to stay here, but, you know, when your aging parents are in another country, you go live in that country, I think is the story. Family, you're from where you're from, right? Even if it's a stupid country, you're still from there. No, it's only stupid in some ways. All countries have their pros and cons, but I like this one. Other questions? Come on, there's one, sorry, I'm coming.
This way of preparing class needs the students to be a bit prepared for the class. So you have to give them, because I teach anatomy, you have to give them a list of things, and Zbigněk Tonár did maybe the same list of things which they should go through. So the students have to be motivated to come to the class to get the other knowledge, yeah?
So, and we didn't talk about that explicitly. We talked about it a little bit in the Motivating Students lecture, the second one, that yeah, you can't talk about transposition of the great vessels if the students don't know what blood vessels are. Or you know, a little more about it than that. So you have to motivate them to prepare for class. There's two basic ways. One is sticks, basically, that is, or the whip, right? Sugar in the whip. And if they arrive at class and you give them a quiz, and they know that that's going to happen, then they usually prepare for it. And the more precise information they have about what's going to be on it, the better. So I absolutely do that. And my students have those little scratch-off forms where they find out instantly whether they have chosen correctly. And so even if they aren't prepared, by the end of the quiz, they know the basic information that's available, although they still got a low score in the quiz, if that happened. So there's that sort of motivation, and then there's the sort of building the internal motivation of students, right? Because ideally, we don't want to, you know, sort of punish them into studying. We want them to be internally motivated to study. And so that really comes with changing the mindset. Where, for me at least, I went from thinking like, I am the guard, like I need to make sure no one passes my class that isn't X smart, to feeling like, okay, you and me, students, we are together on this journey, and we're going to learn a ton. Here we are, and I'm gonna help you as much as I can, and the goal sheet now is sort of the gatekeeper instead of me. And so we sort of turn it around, and I'm like, look, this is the best way that I know how to do this. This is exactly what's going to happen. This is exactly what you need to know. Here's how we're going to do it. I'm doing this so you learn the most. And I think students come around to that. I mean, maybe not every single one of them, but I've seen a tremendous internal motivation from my students when they see that I'm on their side, really, and that what I'm doing is not arbitrary or capricious, but actually intended to help them, fundamentally. Maybe it sounds pie in the sky, but I think it actually can work. I've seen it work, and for many people as well. That's a really, I know that wasn't a short answer, but it could have been a lot longer. So if you want the long answer, let's have coffee sometime. Others? Yep.
I'm teaching mathematics, and the problem is that like there you want to like be able to apply this method, and like you can go essentially arbitrarily like to high difficulty of applying this method, and like some levels of difficulty are what you want the students to do, some levels are clearly out of reach. And how do I make students understand what difficulty like they should be able, and at level of difficulty they should be able to combine the methods or like something? Because if I tell them you should be able to apply the method, show them 2 examples, third example is in the exam, and they say, but we didn't see this method before.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a classic context issue for students that you give them an example of something that, and this has been widely described in the physics literature, where you give students a problem and they can't see how it's connected to these other examples that you've given them. And a great example is, so if you give students physics problems, an expert will think about the type of underlying physics that solves it, and the students will think, this is a pulley problem, this is an inclined plane problem, this is a falling object problem. Instead of thinking about it, they have these surface categorizations. So I think that typically what the literature shows is that the way to help students generalize from these examples and really see the level is to be very explicit about what differentiates one example from the other and say, see, in this example, there were only 2 variables, and in this example, see, there's 3 variables, and so that's a different kind of problem that requires this approach, and that I don't need you to be able to do that, but I need you to be able to do this type of problem. And then show them what we call an isomorphic problem, right, where you're saying, see how this problem has completely different names in it, but it's really the same thing as that other problem. So as explicit as you can be, and that really goes back to goals, that when we're saying do this, what students hear is not always the same because of their lack of context. And so the more context that we can supply them, the more that we can help. I also have some colleagues who work with math and this kind of teaching, so I can put you in contact with them if you think that that would be helpful. Anyone else? Yeah.
Do you ever have lectures for 200 students, for example?
I'm sorry.
Lecture for 200 students. How do you do that?
Yeah. So my classes usually have between 100 and 110 students, so they aren't as big as that. However, I do have my quite good friends and colleagues who teach genetics at my institution to 320, 330 students at once. And, it's not easy. They have a lot of, they have usually like 12 more educated students who are farther along in the program who are walking around the room helping. But yeah, they absolutely spend class time with students solving problems, and they have evidence now. So they actually did a study where they compared the performance of their students, these friends of mine, these colleagues, with a member of our department who the students absolutely adore. He's very good looking and he's a wonderful lecturer. The students prefer this other person's class. If you go online, they're publicly available. You can look at his ratings and their ratings, and the students prefer this other guy, but they learn more in the problem-solving class. And they've shown that with the same test that they all agreed on, the students solving problems. So it's easier if you can break up your class of 200 into 2 classes of 100. But you can do it in a large group. However, if you have some assistance, if possible, that is very helpful. It's not necessary, but it's helpful to have a few people circulating around because you're only one person. Okay? Oh, maybe
If you use the assistants, can you then define what do you mean by a lecture? Because when you talk about having assistants in the room to help with the students, what would they do? And what would you do? What would the lecture be about?
Yeah. So there are a wide variety of possible answers to that question. In my particular class, I spend 27% of the class, it's been actually measured, talking. And the rest of the time is two different things. Either the students are solving the problems, like you guys talking about the worksheet, or we're having a whole class discussion about it, which didn't happen that much today, but has happened in some of the previous workshops that we've had here. So what the assistants are trained to do is, number one, simply help me logistically. So if I need, you know, those voting cards that we often use here and things like that, they're passing them out, they're fixing problems, turning on computers, things like that, whatever's needed. But fundamentally, what they're doing is going to groups of students and saying, okay, what do you guys think about this with Lutzi and the heart defect? Why do you think that? Well, what's wrong with choice D then? And so they're pushing them to think harder and more deeply about whatever, because the teams tend to decide rather quickly, too quickly, what they think the right answer is, and so they give that push. And the class can operate without them, but it operates better with them. Okay, thanks to all of you for all of your activity and participation, and again, I just really appreciate the opportunity, so good job, and take your worksheets with you.